Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends of PISAI, on behalf of the staff members and professors of this Pontifical Institute, I welcome you all for the third public lecture of PISAI for 2019. This evening's lecture is also the third edition of a series entitled the Georgetown Lecture on Contemporary Islam, which was inaugurated in 2017. It is our joy and honor to have with us this evening not only Dr. Patrick Ryan, our main speaker today, but also Dr. John Borelli, who is a special assistant for Catholic identity and dialogue to President John D. Gioia of Georgetown University. John Borelli has been at Georgetown since 2004, where he teaches, manages conferences and events, coordinates dialogue and mission for the Jesuit Conference, and promotes university relations with offices and institutes of the Holy See. Before joining Georgetown University in 2004, John served 16 years, if I am not wrong, at the Secretariat for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. So John has done an immense amount of work, not only in the field of relations between Catholics and the faithful of other religions, but also in the field of ecumenism. And he just brought 2 days ago his latest publication, Catholics and Evangelicals for the Common Good, 2018. And not least of all, John is also a great friend of PISAI, and it is always a pleasure to have you with us. And I've asked John to say a few words of introduction to the lecture series before I introduce this evening's speaker.
Good. Thank you very much, Diego. I'm delighted to be here for this third Georgetown lecture on contemporary Islam, and especially glad that the lecturer this year is Father Patrick Ryan, who has been back in New York for, was it 15 years now, Pat?
Quite, but it seems a long time.
It seems like a long time. And he's been the McKinley Chair at Fordham for the last many years, and he gives a lecture every fall and every spring on both campuses. So 4 lectures, and I try to go to New York to attend those, and I'm delighted I can be here to attend this one. This is a sign of the partnership between Georgetown University and the Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies. My wife and I actually stayed here as guests in 1999 during the Interreligious Assembly, anticipating the Great Jubilee year. But in those days, Archbishop Fitzgerald lived here as he was working in the Vatican. But another great sign of our cooperation is this new president of PISAI, Diego himself. I'm just delighted that he's president, and he's a product of Georgetown University's doctoral program, as well as the Dean of Studies, our Franciscan friend here, Jason. So we have 2 PhDs from Georgetown, and we like the old president too. He is a wonderful man. And he's the man with the smile on his face who's doing great research and writing these days in his stepping down from being the president. And so we are very committed to interreligious understanding among the values that we promote at Georgetown, and we're very dedicated to Islamic studies. And so this seems like a natural relationship. And providing a teacher every fall and spring, as it's happened now for 3 years, for a short course on some aspect of contemporary Islam, and then at least once a year having this public lecture. So I'm delighted we can continue this work. We're training a new generation of young scholars to carry on our work. I took my doctorate 43 years ago, so it's time to pass on the torch. And when my wife says, "Are you ever going to retire?" I don't know. I'm so dedicated to interreligious dialogue and ecumenism, ecumenical dialogue, that it's difficult to step down from that. But we'll see one of these years. But I'm sure all of you young people will do a much better job than we've done, because you have all this great groundwork ahead of you that we've done for you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Thank you, George. We welcome Father Patrick Ryan, our main speaker. Father Patrick is the Lawrence McGinley Professor of Religion and Society at Fordham University, a native New Yorker himself. Father Ryan entered the Society of Jesus in 1957.
I was only 4 years old at the time.
An early vocation. And was ordained to the priesthood in 1968. So you were 14 then? Patrick earned a bachelor's and master's degrees in English literature and language at Fordham, and a PhD in the comparative history of religion from Harvard University, with a specialization in Arabic and Islamic studies. So something very that we know about, something about that also here at PISAI. Arabic and Islamic studies. So, and there at Harvard, he studied with the famous Canadian scholar of Islam, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, and also with the German scholar of Islamic mysticism, Anne-Marie Schimmel. For about half of his life as a Jesuit priest, Father Ryan worked in West Africa, and that's the main reason why he's here today. But it's not only today, but he's teaching this for the last 2 weeks and a half. He has been teaching a course on Islam in Africa here at PISAI to our second year students. So for about half of his life as a Jesuit priest, I was saying, Father Patrick Ryan worked in West Africa, mostly in Nigeria and Ghana. He has had faculty and administrative appointments at the University of Ghana, also at the University of Cape Coast in Ghana, at Hekima College in Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya, and also here in Rome at the Gregorian University. He served as the first president of Loyola Jesuit College, a secondary school in Nigeria's federal capital, Abuja. And Father Ryan has held numerous positions at Fordham. He has taught Middle Eastern studies. He held the Loyola Chair in the Humanities and served as Fordham's Vice President for University Mission and Ministry from 2005 to 2009 until his appointment in July 2009 as the McGinley Professor, succeeding the late Avery Cardinal Dulles. He is the author of numerous articles, scholarly and popular, and also of 4 books. And I just want to mention the very last one that he was kindly offered as a copy, and I can show you it's already been registered and catalogued. The title is very nice, very meaningful. Amen. Jews, Christians, and Muslims keep faith with God, published by the Catholic University of America Press in 2018. So dear Patrick, it's been a pleasure to get to know you these last 2 weeks, and I've enjoyed the conversation, and I'm very much looking forward to listening to you this evening. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I think you know my title is The Call to Jihad and the Lure of Prosperity, Contemporary Polarities in African Islam and Christianity. Like St. Paul, I want to begin with words of gratitude. First of all, I give thanks to God that I'm still more or less standing at the age of 79, going on 100. Secondly, I give thanks for Georgetown University, which once offered me a job in 1982, just after a particularly unhappy coup d'etat in Ghana. in more provincial times, the New York Provincial Superior told me not to take the offer, but to hold out for something at Fordham. Georgetown has brought me here to the Pontificio Istituto di Studi Arabi et Islamistica, an institution I have admired for many decades, where I have been privileged to teach during this month of March. Special thanks within Georgetown go to Dr. John Borelli and the President of Georgetown, Dr. John DeGioia. Within PISAI, my thanks go to Father Diego Sadio Correa of the Missionaries of Africa, and Father Jason Bella of the Order of Friars Minor, and Father Martin Wurabai, also a missionary of Africa, my Degao brother, who has taken me by the hand, helped me to find PISAI, and to find my way back home to the Residencia San Pietro Canisio. Shukran jiddan. I am sorry not to have as my respondent this evening Dr. John Azuma, a Friday-born man. Azuma is from Juma, from the Friday prayer, from the Upper East corner of Ghana. The late Professor Lamin Sane of Yale University, a friend of mine since 1975, who died on January 6th of this year, first brought me into contact with John Azuma. I dedicate what I have to say this evening to the memory of Lamin. Like Icarus in classical mythology, Lamin has gone before us, soaring toward the sun, but he has not fallen to the earth. In the typical Sabellianism of James Joyce, the son, Icarus, is also the father, Daedalus, the inventor of winged flight. Of this son of the Gambia and son of Muslim faith in the Manding tradition, who is also the father of a new Christian missiology surrounding the vernacular translatability of Christian faith, are Icarus and Daedalus combined. I use the words with which James Joyce concluded the portrait of the artist as a young man. Old father, old artificer, stand me now and ever in good stead. Africa as a continent is something of a fiction. There are two great continents in the world. The Americas, only artificially separated a century or so ago by the Panama Canal, and the Afro-Eurasian landmass, only artificially separated by the Suez Canal in the 19th century. There is a distinct possibility that the Americas and the Afro-Eurasian landmass are really one large continent connected by the once frozen Bering Straits, the bridge that brought humankind from Central Asia into the Americas. As for those of you from places like Indonesia and Japan and Australia, you're offshore casinos. The hypothesis of prehistoric continental drift suggests that the great western face of Africa once nested just below the great eastern face of South America that we call Brazil. I think of these two great continents, in the words of an old song, as dancing cheek to cheek. There is, in any case, only one humankind, even when we humans are sometimes most unkind to each other. There are no illegal aliens in the world God created. In the words of the Roman playwright Terence, Homo sum, humania illa me alienum puto. I am a human being. I think of nothing that is human as foreign to me. My subject this evening centers on two faith traditions, both of them migratory, Christianity and Islam. Representatives of these two faith traditions have come into the African part of that Afro-Eurasian landmass a long time ago. The Jewish tradition of faith, however, preceded both Christianity and Islam in Africa, coming to Alexandria in Egypt in Hellenistic times, were present as well south of Egypt in Nubia, the three kingdoms that developed millennia ago along the cataracts of the Nile in what is now southern Egypt and northern Sudan. A Jewish eunuch from Nubia, treasurer to the Queen Mother, or Kandake, came to Jerusalem on pilgrimage in the first century of the Common Era, according to the Acts of the Apostles. On his return journey, the deacon Philip opened up for this Nubian Jew the meaning of the fourth song of the servant of the Lord in 2nd Isaiah, baptizing him in some water by the roadside. First African Christian was a Jewish Christian. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that the infant Jesus himself and his parents, like Israel of old, had taken refuge in Egypt from Herod the Great. We Western Christians call this migration the flight into Egypt. Egyptian Christians call it the glorious advent of our Lord Jesus Christ in the land of Egypt. A Jew from what is now Libya, Simon of Cyrene, helped Jesus carry his cross. There is little reason to doubt the historicity of the arrival of Greek-speaking Jewish Christians in Alexandria within the 1st century of the Common Era. 2 of the 5 polytriumvira, or political divisions of Alexandria, were Jewish during the lifetime of the philosopher Philo-Judaeus, who died in 50 of the Common Era. Ancient traditions of Ethiopia also trace a connection to King Solomon through his consort, the Queen of Sheba, the mother of Menelik I, and the ancestress of the emperors in the Solomonic dynasty that only ended with the murder of Haile Selassie in 1975. Islam arrived in Africa in the heart of one involuntarily expatriated African, a Habashi, or Ethiopian slave in Mecca, Bilal ibn Rabah. The slave Bilal suffered for his faith, but was rescued from slavery by Waraka ibn Nawfal, a possibly Christian relative of Khadija, the Prophet's wife, as well as by Abu Bakr, Muhammad's lieutenant and first successor, at least in the Sunni tradition. Bilal, the first African Muslim, sang and chanted with a voice that soothed the heart of the Prophet. Thus it was that Bilal became Muhammad's favorite muezzin, the mosque functionary who caused Muslims to worship. Egypt in particular arrived in Islam before Islam arrived in Egypt, when Muhammad took as one of his consorts Maria the Qabt, Maria Qibtiyya, the mother of Muhammad's only son, Ibrahim, who died as an infant. An Arab Muslim general, a companion of the Prophet Amr ibn al-As, started the conquest of Byzantine colonized Egypt 7 years after Muhammad's death. And Muslim Arab hegemony gradually replaced Byzantine and Latin Christian hegemonies in North Africa west of Egypt over the next 70 years. North Africa, once prosperous, had been depopulated a century or two earlier by the Vandals, and the retaking of parts of North Africa by the Byzantines had further weakened the social and political structures of the area. Islam entered Europe from Africa precisely in the year 711, when another Muslim general, Tariq ibn Ziyad, grabbed Europe by its big toe, Jabal Tariq, Tariq's mountain, better known as Gibraltar. Gradually, Muslim Arabs penetrated south of the Byzantine and Latin colonies of North Africa, reaching the territories of the so-called Berber populations, who are now inland Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. Ibn Khaldun, a 14th century Berber himself, says that the Berbers repudiated Islam 12 times before they finally embraced it. When did Muslims first bring their faith tradition to Saharan and sub-Saharan Africa? It happened later in the parts of Africa closest to Arabia than it did in the zone south of the area called in Arabic the furthest west, Al-Maghrib al-Aqsa. Morocco, Western Sahara, and Mauritania today. That term also can be used, of course, for Iberia. The Arabs had less to do with it than you might imagine, unless you use the word Arab to designate everyone who speaks some Arabic an Arab. I speak some English, but I am not, definitely not, English. The Sadhaja, or Sunaga, a Western Berber confederation located in southern Morocco and Western Sahara, went from nominal Muslim belonging to active and even fierce Muslim belonging in the 11th century of the Common Era. The Sanaja Morabitun, or Almoravids, moved north in Morocco and conquered much of Spain. They also moved south into the area where Mauritania and Mali meet, although there are doubts that they ever conquered the ancient kingdom of Ghana, after which, for romantic reasons, Gold Coast was renamed in 1957. The indigenous peoples of the Sahara, moving further and further south as that great ocean of dryness increased dramatically in the early first millennium of the Common Era, probably had much in common with the people who made the cave drawings at Tassili Najer in southern Algeria in prehistoric antiquity. Hunters of animals and collectors of wild grains, the people in the cave drawings give some evidence that they may have been gradually developing into cattle herders and possibly even planters and reapers. Scarcity caused by increasing desiccation, the result of climate change, overgrazing, overfarming, emptied what became the Sahara of its herders and farmers. Horses could find enough water to cross the Sahara in earlier Roman times, but the camel had to be introduced into the Sahara from Arabia around 100 of the Common Era. We can only guess at the faith traditions of these primeval pre-Saharan hunters and herders, collectors of wild grain, and possible planters and reapers. But we know a great deal more about the herders and farmers of sub-Saharan Africa today, especially because of the research done by archaeologists, historians, ethnographers, social and cultural anthropologists over the past century. Some of that research has been excellent, some of it guesswork. Forgive me now if I must make a few generalizations about what has been reified, made into a thing, and called African traditional religion in modern times. I particularly dislike its reduction to an acronym, ATR. There is no one thing indicated by that term, but rather a range of varying traditions in different parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Those who champion ATR usually describe it as something very close to the ideas of the transcendent held by their own pre-Christian forebears, sometimes crossed with notions of the Greek or Roman pantheons picked up in school. Muslims in Africa have shown much less interest in so-called ATR than Christians, tending to class such things with the Jahiliyyah or ignorance in pre-Islamic Arabia. Both Muslims and Christians have oversimplified traditional forms of faith in sub-Saharan Africa. For some sub-Saharan African populations, their ancestors, matrilineal, patrilineal, and bilateral, play a great role in the lives of the living. For others, they do not. Other African populations revere mysterious powers connected with particular geographical places or things: crossroads, deep caves, great mountains, forest groves, springs of water, smaller or larger rivers, oases, ocean inlets. Some Africans venerate ancestors as well as mysterious powers identified with localized shrines. Some fuse ancestors, especially royal ancestors, with the mysterious powers of particular places or things. Some Africans revere powers connected with destiny, identify as one's individual spirit or soul or even head. Some sub-Saharan Africans have a strong sense for a power behind all lesser powers, above all lesser powers, below all lesser powers. Some identify that power beyond lesser powers as God, with a capital G. Others identify that power beyond lesser powers with Earth, with a capital E. The horizon of being, to use a Heideggerian term made popular by Karl Rahner, presents itself in many disguises in non-Muslim and non-Christian African traditions. The vo'alchim, an adverb used as a noun by Rana, is the direction toward which our human transcendence is aimed, like an arrow. We never hit the target. We never grasp it completely. The vo'alchim surrounds, supports, surprises us at every turn on the road of life. All human beings in every age and clime have sensed or glimpsed that horizon of being as the background of their knowing and loving, although not every human being has thematized that knowing and loving in philosophical and theological terms. At the same time, in the pre-Islamic and pre-Christian religious traditions of Africa, there is often a sense that elements of what might be described as traditional faith are useful, revered because they produce tangible results. Many Africans say there is more crime now when Christianity and Islam prevail than there was in pre-Christian and pre-Islamic days. Those who make this claim seldom lived in pre-Christian or pre-Islamic days in Africa. They claim, however, that people feared to violate the prohibitions of the gods and the ancestors, but they know that God, as venerated in the Christian tradition, and God as venerated in the Islamic tradition, the one and only God, is merciful and forgiving. Too merciful and too forgiving. There is, however, in traditional forms of faith in Africa, less made of submission to God's inscrutable will than there is a desire to manipulate supernal power for pragmatic ends. The Fulbeck cattle herder looks for transcendent guidance as he drives his herds to grasslands or to water, and for protection against beasts of prey. A Yoruba, intent on revenge against a competitor in love, ties up an elaborate knot called a lock, which he casts into a local river. An Ewe taxi driver, annoyed with me for refusing to pay an exorbitant amount to get me from where I was staying to where my car was being repaired, curses my Volkswagen with imprecations meant to bring it back soon for even more repairs. Is this only the result of Christianity and Islam reducing traditional faith to magical practice? Or are traditional forms of faith simply more pragmatic in their composition? Even within Christianity, there are elements of the pragmatic in prayer. The blessing of throats on the Feast of St. Blaise, fixing images of St. Christopher on dashboards, rosaries used as necklaces, even by pop stars, St. Anthony of Padua, venerated every Tuesday for his many talents. Lest you think I find such pragmatic, indeed magical practice only among Catholics, I know many Protestants who favor bibliomancy, opening the Bible at random and placing a finger on a verse to determine what choice to make in a difficult situation. Within Islam, there is a special form of the 5 times daily salat to be used when there is drought and a need for rain, the salat of istisqa. There is another recommended for protection during a total eclipse of the sun. The Quran itself ends with 2 refuge takings, the last 2 surahs of the Quran, which enable those who recite them to seek protection from witches and other powers of darkness. In Muslim folk custom, there is also divination practiced with the randomly opened Quran, or even with the randomly cast prayer beads, the subha. I found particularly interesting more than 40 years ago, among the Muslim Yoruba, the use of a small pamphlet covered on the outside with opaque paper, within which were written 4 times, each of 2 verses from the Quran. Whoever does good, even an atom's worth, will see it then. And whoever does evil, even an atom's worth, will see it then. That's Quran 99, verses 7 and 8. To each of the 8 written verses, a string was attached, and the one seeking an answer to a difficult question was asked, after the little pamphlet was flipped around a few times, to pick one string and then find out whether the course of action contemplated would lead to good or bad consequences. Christianity and Islam, however, define themselves more broadly than such practices might suggest. Both Christianity and Islam are traditions of surrender and faith to God's mercy and love. That mercy and love concretized in Jesus as the Word of God made present and active in the Church and its sacraments, or in the Quran as the Word of God, delivered to humankind through the Prophet and exemplified in his Sunnah, practiced within the Ummah. Christians have taken a more positive view of the forms of traditional faith in Africa than have educated African Muslims. But I would like to suggest that much of traditional faith in Africa has been instrumental, pragmatic, results-oriented. Some African Christians and some African Muslims have thought that Christianity and Islam could learn a great deal from this instrumental, pragmatic, results-oriented faith. Perhaps that is so, and then again, perhaps not. Christianity only arrived in sub-Saharan Africa, apart from Nubia, Aksum, and the Horn of Africa, in the era of Portuguese exploration of the West African coast and the quest for a route around Africa to India in the late 15th century. Portuguese and later Dutch and English interest in West Africa was mainly centered on slavery and the exportation of human cargo across the Atlantic to work the European plantations of the New World in the era after the voyages of Columbus. Christianity did not penetrate very deep into West Africa, precisely because of its identification with slavery, just as Islam did not penetrate very deeply into East Africa for the same reason. It was only pietists of Moravian and eventually Danish and English origin who brought the first Protestant missions to the West African coast in the 18th century, although the Portuguese slavers did convert some of their collaborators. Once the papacy had cast off the terrible bondage of the Spanish padronado and the Portuguese padroado, with their monopoly on the new worlds of Latin America, Africa, South and Island Asia since the late 15th century, Catholic missionary work to begin in earnest in Africa, mainly in the 19th century. The mosquito and the tsetse fly did much to slow down all Christian missionary work in Africa. But the Christianization of sub-Saharan Africa, begun in the colonial era, has advanced dramatically in the era of independence, especially after 1960, as Lamine Sane has more than once pointed out. In contemporary Africa, however, Christians and Muslims have succumbed in recent years to what I think of as deformations of their faith traditions. For Christians, it is what I characterize as the prosperity gospel, and for Muslims, it has been the call to jihad. I capitalize that to distinguish it just from jihad. Each tradition originated outside Africa, the first in the United States, and the second in the oil-rich Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia. Some of you will think that jihad is as old as Islam, and it is. But the modern call to jihad dates back to the oil boom of the 1970s, and the use of at least some of that wealth accumulated by Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states to influence Islam in other parts of the world. The lure of prosperity within the Christian tradition may be as old as the first power couple in Christianity, Ananias and Sapphira. But the modern prosperity gospel arose in the United States in the competitive televangelism of some latter-day preachers in the lineage of Norman Vincent Peale, who died in 1993, creator of a movement aimed at what was called positive thinking, a mixture of comfortable Christianity with popular psychology. Of Norman Vincent Peale, the famous Adlai Stevenson, an American politician, said, "It matters theological I find Paul appealing and Peel appalling. In the years since the decline of Peel's popularity, other varieties of positive thinking have grown dramatically in the United States, and especially in the churches that propagate what has been called the prosperity gospel. It's also sometimes called the word of faith. Easily exported, the prosperity gospel has caught on as well in economically volatile third world settings, especially in Africa and Latin America over the last 3 decades. Several popular American television preachers fit loosely into this category of Christianity, but not all of them are entirely happy with such a characterization. Such preachers seldom mention sin or repentance in their preaching. They do a great deal to encourage financial success among their adherents. And with that success, they generate free will offerings to the televangelist ministries. The therapeutic pursuit of happiness, dislodged from the Protestant Christian foundations, still visible in the preaching of Norman Vincent Peale, has triumphed in the careers of such prosperity gospel preachers in the United States as Joel Osteen, Creflo Dollar, Joyce Myers, Kenneth Copeland, Kenneth Hagin, and Reverend Ike. Even if prosperity churches started in the United States and have roots that can be traced back to the 19th century in that country, they have given birth to prosperity gospel churches in sub-Saharan Africa since the 1980s at least, and the charismatic preachers in these churches have modeled themselves on American televangelists. Some of them have even managed to get Alabama accents. The new African televangelists differ from earlier African church independency movements. 2 types of African-originated Christian churches can be traced back to the early 20th century in much of West Africa and also in South Africa. What the Swedish scholar Bengt Hunkler called Ethiopianist churches arose in South Africa as an indigenous African reaction to the European domination of Christian ecclesial bodies. Such churches originally sought what I call personnel Africanization, not cultural Africanization. In West Africa, they remained mainstream Protestant, but rejected European domination. They're a trifle quaint today, but they still exist, often with titles like United Native African Church and the like. Their original reason to exist, competition with expatriate-dominated Anglican or Methodist or Presbyterian churches, has evaporated with time. What Sinclair characterized as Zionist churches in South Africa, churches called Aladura churches in Nigeria, and spiritual churches in Ghana, for instance, continue to exist in South Africa and West Africa. The members of these churches dress in somewhat angelic or even sometimes military style. They encourage speaking in tongues, they dance, and they sing. What was eventually called the Church of the Seraphim and Cherubim in Nigeria started in Lagos, where Moses Oromolade Tunolashe developed from the visionary experience of an adolescent girl, Christina Abiodun Akinshowun, the idea that people are to worship God as the angelic choirs do. Christina's first vision started when she witnessed a Catholic Corpus Christi procession in Lagos and felt that one of the angelic figures on the side of the monstrance, bearing the Eucharistic species, followed her for days. There are many such churches in Nigeria and Ghana, but they have gone into decline in recent years with the development of the prosperity churches. Once you have gone to a university, it becomes more difficult to come home from work, take off your shoes and socks, don a long white robe, and walk barefoot to an Aladura or spiritual church. It is easier and more attractive to stay in your business attire and go straight from work to an evening session of prayer and praise in a prosperity church. You may still be able to dance and sing, but the male and female preachers in these churches also generally wear business attire, as do your fellow worshippers. The preaching and singing and waving of hands in unison, which is called wipers because it resembles windscreen or windshield wipers, is quite lovely and offers some solace after a long, hard day in the office. Furthermore, it promises future promotions at work, abundance of worldly goods in this life, happiness in marriage, especially if your future marriage partner is a fellow Prosperity Church attendee. Little emphasis is made in these prosperity churches on the salvific meaning of the cross of Christ crucified, or the need for repentance of sin. On the contrary, the God worshipped in such churches is a rich God, and riches attained while participating in these churches are to be displayed in the way one dresses, the vehicle one drives, the jubilation that seems to be a permanent mood of the participants. I would like to suggest that prosperity churches in Africa, whatever their local histories, are modeled on American televangelism. The leaders of such churches are often free to profit from their ministry without much accounting made for donations to the ministry. My God is not a poor God, one such Nigerian prosperity evangelist, the late Archbishop Benson Idahosa, put it some years ago. And he said there's no reason why we have to worship God in rags. The wealth of the televangelist is a matter of pride for his followers, who wish to follow him or her down that path or up that ladder. The connection between worldly success and the gospel preached in these churches derives not only from the American bourgeois model, but also, I think, from the instrumental, pragmatic, results-oriented cultural matrix of traditional forms of African faith. Every once in a while, a schism develops in such churches, and new prosperity churches appear. All too often, moral lapses on the part of the televangelists leading such churches play their part in causing such schisms. Despite these lapses, prosperity churches march on, building bigger and bigger sanctuaries in Africa and establishing branch offices overseas for the African diaspora. The Redeemed Christian Church of God has the ideal that you would never have to walk more than 15 minutes to get to one of their churches. On to Islam. Jihad fi sabilillah, struggle on the path of God, has been a constant element in Islam since its beginnings. That struggle, however, despite what you see in the media, is not always or ordinarily military action. The greater jihad, al-jihad al-akbar, for Muslims, is the struggle against one's own vices. The lesser jihad, jihad al-asghar, is military action in the defense of Muslim communities. Both types of jihad have long histories. What I describe as the call to jihad, that has become more prominent in contemporary Muslim settings in Africa, takes its model, as I mentioned earlier, from the example set by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia since the 1970s oil boom. Oil boom spells prosperity for oil producers and trouble for oil consumers. Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf producers of oil have been building futuristic cities in the desert, art museums, desalination plants, airlines known for their creature comforts. The same Gulf oil producers have imported cheap labor from South Asia and Island Asia, who are sometimes virtually enslaved in their places of work. Possibly recognizing the secularization that is going on in the Gulf, and especially these days in Saudi Arabia, more effort has been made since 1973 to export the neo-Hanbalite, so-called Wahhabiyya version of Islam to places east and west and north and south of the Gulf. Efforts have been made in recent years to relax the prohibitions, especially on women, in places like Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia is more and more an exporter, not only of oil, but of the puritanical view of Islam, as Khalid Abul-Kafadl labels it. The new call to jihad is also a way for the Saudis and some of their fellow plutocrats in the Gulf to employ their Muslim scholars overseas, where they cannot interfere too much in the internal affairs of their oil-rich countries of origin. Pakistan sought financial aid from Saudi Arabia in 1974 and found that one of the terms of the aid they sought from the Saudis was to declare the Indo-Pakistani Ahmadiyya movement non-Muslim. Pakistan dutifully did so. Dr. Humphrey Fisher, Lamin Sané's doctoral dissertation director at the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies, and a major advisor of my own dissertation at Harvard, predicted in 1974 that Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states would soon extend their influence in Muslim areas of Africa, not only against Ahmadiyya, but also against varieties of Sufism, the Islamic tradition of mysticism, that Saudis have opposed since the foundation of the first Saudi kingdom in the late 18th century. The anti-Sufi, neo-Hanbalite ideology of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who died in 1792, derived from the 14th century Puritanism of Ibn Taymiyyah, who died in 1528. Allied with the House of Saud, the Al Saud, the disciples of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, the Al al-Sheikh, financed by Saudi money, have penetrated much of sub-Saharan Africa and laid siege to long-established mystical confraternities like the Qadariyya and the Tijaniya over the last 40 years or more, to say nothing of their opposition to Ahmadiyya. One of the curious and unintended side effects of the Saudi-backed neo-Hanbalism in West Africa has been the alliances struck up between Iranian government operatives in West Africa and Sunni Sufi confraternities. Especially since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, Iranian embassies in West Africa have encouraged the development of al-Bayt schools and clinics named after the people of the household: Muhammad, his daughter Fatima, his son-in-law and cousin Ali ibn Abi Talib, his grandsons Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein. Some of my own Muslim students in Ghana found working for such al-Bayt schools a profitable way to advance their studies, especially after the collapse of Gaddafi's Libya and its eccentric Green Book ideology, which they had tried. Have my Sunni former students become Shiites? It is hard to say. The Shia Ali often protects itself with the technique taqiyya, prudent dissimulation. It's what we Jesuits used to call, mental reservation. A Nigerian Shiite movement since the 1980s, calling itself the Islamic movement in Nigeria, definitely non-Sufi in its doctrine and practice, traces its origins to this disenchantment with Sunni Muslim leadership in Nigeria by Ibrahim al-Zakzaki, once a student at Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria. In 1979, Zakzaki, 26 years of age at the time, began to identify his faith with that of the new Iranian government headed by the late Imam Khomeini. Zakzaki, as far as I can determine, has been detained in prison in Abuja since 2015, and the recent re-election of President Buhari does not bode well for Zakzaki's release anytime soon. Although he and his wife did have a day in court in January 2019 and were granted bail, but they were not set free. Tragically, 6 of their 9 children have been killed in confrontations with uniformed Nigerian authorities over the last decade. Recall, however, that 12 Shiism thrives on shahadat, the witness of martyrdom. Islam in West Africa owes much of its identity to Sufi missionaries in times past and even today. In his 2016 book, Beyond Jihad, The Pacifist Tradition in West African Islam, Lamin Sané points out how Sufi Muslims have spread Islam by example and by their abilities as holy personages, their utility. The Saudis hate Sufism and have sponsored neo-Hanbalite mosques different from the central mosques of more Sufi orientation in places like Tamale in Ghana's northern region. Several of my best students in Ghana came from such neo-Hanbalite mosque communities in Ghana, and it took some effort to get them to take seriously my interest in Sufism. The call to jihad imported from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf appeals to the same instrumental, pragmatic, results-oriented matrix that promotes prosperity churches in West Africa. Your mosque school will thrive with Saudi assistance. The Islamic University of Medina will bring you there to study, or send you teachers of Neo-Hanbalite Islam. If your state in northern Nigeria has implemented a Sharia criminal code, you can get a job as a qadi. There are few competent competitors. Younger generation Muslims, in any case, are a bit fed up with the semi-literate devotees of Sufi confraternities like the Qadiriya and the Tijaniya. Organize a Jihad week on your university campus to compete with Campus Crusade for Christ. Furthermore, there are opportunities to be had for further education in the Sunni Arab Muslim world if you know enough Arabic. It is not for nothing that a famous hadith urges Muslims to seek learning, even if it be in China. Atlubu ilma la bisin. Saudi Arabia is much closer. What you may ask is the revolutionary movement called in the press Boko Haram. Is this derived from the modern call to jihad? I think not. Its formal title, translated from Arabic, is the Community of Sunni People for Propagation of Islam and for Struggle for the Faith. By a peculiar irony, this movement began 2 decades or more ago in the one area of northern Nigeria, the ancient Kanem Borno region, the northwest, that never submitted to the Sokoto Jihad of 1804 to 1809. The May Borno and his plenipotentiary scholar general, Muhammad al-Amin al-Kanani, successfully resisted the puritanical reforms advocated by the leadership of Sokoto, Uthman Dan Fodio, and Muhammad Bello, his son, and his brother Abdullahi Dan Fodio. In recent years, however, the comparative underdevelopment of extreme northeastern Nigeria, the Kanem Borno area, provided educated young men from that area with motivation to attack the inadequate schools and other state and federal government agencies. Nigerian police and army brutality further exacerbated the anger of the youthful critics of local and federal governments. In the talk by John Azuma, you can see the killing of Muhammad Yusuf. He was simply shot randomly by a policeman after being rounded. Just took a gun and blew it right to his head. Anyway, a lifetime of educational exposure to the idealized story of the Sokoto Jihad, as well as the provision of militant literature from Salafi Egyptians like the late Sayyid Qutb, also encouraged hope for success in such militancy. Military inadequacy and corruption within the Nigerian army have also played their part in the failure to contain this movement. This is not the modern call to jihad. Saudi Arabia is not connected with it. Boko Haram is the old jihad, recycled, combined with some strange elements of savage male chauvinism. If you have a few hours sometime, as my students at PISAI can tell you, I could elaborate at greater length on this phenomenon. In pointing out the ways that the Christian prosperity gospel and the Neo-Hanbalite call to jihad distort both Christianity and Islam, I do not want to leave you this evening with the impression that Christianity and Islam in Africa south of the Sahara have been totally overcome by such manipulation of faith. Let me conclude with the stories of an African Muslim and an African Christian who were saints, each in his own way. I happen to be a friend of each of them. Undoubtedly, both were sinners as well, like myself, so I was not completely uncomfortable in their presence. It is easier, I find, to live with fellow sinners than to live with saints. My Muslim friend, a Tijani Sufi from Nima in central Accra, was usually called Malam Baba, Papa Teacher. His real name was Muhammad ibn Masood, a Kano Hausa whose family came to Accra in the late 19th century. Malam Baba had over the years gained a reputation as one who was Mustajab al-Dua, one whose prayer is answered. Businessmen and politicians used to hire Malam Baba as a professional man of prayer for their secular concerns. By the time I got to know Malam Baba, however, He was becoming more and more blind, the result of a brain tumor. He was also becoming more and more interior, more and more spiritual. During the 1979 election campaign, one of the major political parties tried to hire Malam Baba to come to Kumasi, stay in a decent hotel, and simply pray for the success of the candidate they were putting forward at their convention to lead the party to victory. Malam Baba sent a disciple to do the praying in Kumasi. He told me he was no longer interested in such things. All Malam Baba wanted to do was talk with me about God, about Jesus, and about Muhammad. And so we did weekly for about a year. I began by taking notes, but I gave up. I simply gave up. They were gibberish. Malam Baba was not interested in becoming a Christian, but he was interested in talking and praying with a Christian about the things of God. I went on sabbatical at the end of that year. And while I was away, a taxi full of Malam Baba's disciples came to my house on campus looking for me. But I was far away in New York. Malam Baba was dying and wanted to talk with me once more. Richiamo, alla. May God have mercy on him. I miss you, Malam Baba. We will meet, inshallah, in the presence of the one and only God. My Christian friend, David Fuseni Abdullahi, started life as a Muslim in Tamale in northern Ghana. Born into a family of lepers, he became a Christian despite great opposition from his family. I first met him when he was a first-year medical student at the University of Ghana. He resolved as he progressed in his medical studies to serve the poorest of the poor back in Tamale, where he eventually ran a free medical facility, Shekinah Clinic. Archbishop and later Cardinal Peter Porter-Godelli helped the clinic along, as did many other benefactors. Priests and nuns liked to come to the clinic, but there was only one rule. They had to wait in line like everybody else. Dr. Abdullahi became known as the mad doctor of Tamale, not because he was mad himself, but because he used to feed mad people wandering around central Tamale with a food van he sent into town every day at midday. He cared for AIDS victims when other hospitals feared to take them in during the era before antiretrovirals. David was no saint, but an ordinary sinner like you and like me. There were problems in his marriage, I gather, that I knew little about. I last met David in 2016 when he lay dying of cancer of the tongue in the military hospital in Accra. His tongue had already been excised. He explained his marital difficulties to me as much as he could with a laptop, but it was no longer time to discuss these things. We prayed together. He died a couple of weeks after I last saw him. Traffic came to a halt in heavily Muslim Tamale the day of his funeral. He had insisted that he be buried in the graveyard of his clinic with the victims of AIDS to whom he had ministered. He wanted no casket, just a shroud around his emaciated body. I miss you, Dr. David. We will meet again, Deo volente, in the presence of the one and only God. These are two of the saints I knew in Ghana. There were saints in Nigeria as well. There were saints as well in other places where I lived and worked during 26 years. Sometimes Christianity and Islam have been instrumentalized in Africa, but not always. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Truly to God we are returning, only to God. Requiescant in pace. May they rest in peace. With these words I conclude.